If you would, pull out your phone and go to your Bible app and read our morning scripture, or you can look on the screens with me. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians 10, and we're going to read 5 through 11. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. This is the word of the Lord.
It's going to take me a second. I've got a hurt back here, so I wish I had a cool story to tell on it. Just getting old. All right, hey, good to see you guys. My name's Dusty, one of the pastors here. I'm really grateful that you're all here. So we're picking up in 1 Corinthians 10. This is going to be our last sermon in 1 Corinthians, and we're going to pick back up with another one in 1 Corinthians 10 in the spring. I'm going to be rolling into Christmas next week. So all of you big-time Christmas people, you just can wait until then. We'll be happening. So what I want to do is to kind of pick up where we left off in chapter 9 as it moves into chapter 10 this week, recap the first few verses, and then tell you what we're going to be talking about. So at the end of chapter 9, the Apostle Paul makes a case of, hey, basically he's in it to win it, and that nothing is more important than Jesus, that we're single-minded, and we're going after an imperishable wreath, in other words, like a gold medal, that there's this eternal one. An athlete competes for one in the here and now, but we're going for an imperishable one, one that lasts forever, and that's the stakes. And nothing's more important than Jesus. Nothing's more important than Jesus making sense to our friends and neighbors and people all around the world. And so that was chapter 9, and then it goes right into chapter 10, and he makes a really interesting, it's actually, I wish we had time just to talk about these first 4 verses in this chapter. If you're following along with us on our reading plan, you're going to see these. And he makes some links between Israel and, in a lot of ways, the Corinthian church, that there's even some links where he makes a case that they're actually following Jesus as they were in the wilderness. And so I think there's a few things you can make a case of as he's pulling back from the Old Testament, is that a lot more than we may sometimes read the Bible as, that the Bible's one whole book, unified, leading up to Jesus' birth, his death, his resurrection, and then walking through the implications of it, waiting for his return. It's one book, and he's really making a case here, that making a connection that hopefully the Corinthians would see, hopefully that me and you would see, that they're a lot more similar to Israel in the wilderness than they might have imagined. And that's really what leads us up to these next few verses. And so what we're going to be talking about today is I'm going to use 2 terms kind of interchangeably: temptation and idolatry, because Paul's going to kind of go back and forth using those 2 terms, temptation and idolatry. And Israel was tempted. Israel dealt with idolatry. And he very clearly is making the case and even warning the Corinthian church, and then by extension, me and you, against idolatry and against temptation all at the same time. So that's where we're going to be going. So let's go ahead and pick up in verse 5. This is what Chase read just a moment ago, and I want to read these verses and just like point out a few things, and we're going to actually have 4 points about them before we move on to the rest of the chapter. It says, nevertheless, this is talking about Israel, again, pulling from them, but making some links with the Corinthian church. It says, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the desert. So like things did not go well for them there. Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. So again, he's making that link, a lot of continuity between Israel and the Corinthians, saying, look, that need to be careful. These were examples. You should be learning from Israel's experience there. And so should we. Do not be idolaters. There's the first time we've seen that language, as some of them were. As it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Then he continues on with idolatry, but in a surprising way, because I think a lot of us may imagine idolatry to be only whenever you have like a little object that you kind of bow down to and, whatever, that kind of thing. And for sure, even that first example there, when we talked about them sat down, eating, drinking, rising up to play, what was going on in the middle of that is they're fashioning an idol while Moses was up talking to God. All right, that was what all that was happening. That's the reference there. But the rest of these aren't like a little tiki idol that you bow down to. Like they're all other things that you replace God with. And that's how you need to think of idolatry. Like sexual immorality is the first one that's mentioned here. It's 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they are written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So again, he's making that link, going, hey, these things were all there. They were struggling with temptation. They were struggling with idolatry, and they're written down, and they're actually written down for you. That's the whole point. These things serve as a warning for all of us to learn from. So I think what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time in these four verses, these several verses with 4 points. And when I was preparing for the sermon, I ran across a really interesting article. And the article was from this passage, and the title of it is 4 Warnings for People in Their 20s. Which is interesting. So a lot of the 20-year-olds are like, what? And like wipe off their foam from their fancy drink, and they drink and know what? But you need to know this, though. These 4 warnings are also incredibly good for people in their teens. They're also incredible warnings for people in their 40s. They're incredible warnings for people in our 70s. And so you could have easily written that article and been like, oh, actually the 60-year-olds in here are struggling with the same basic things that the 20-year-olds are. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I give credit. Plagiarism isn't cool. So we're going to walk through these 4 questions about idolatry and temptation, and I've adapted it a bit from the form of from the article I read, but it was so helpful. I just thought this organization might help us kind of wrap our mind around a few things. So here's the 4 questions. The first one is, do you distract yourself with entertainment? Oh yeah. Verse 7. So verse 7 said, do not be idolaters as some of them were. And it said they sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. Now, this comes from Exodus 32. That's what he's going to do, is he's going to take a string of quotations from the Old Testament, and then again, he's making a link between the Corinthians and us, really, that we would see a link between us and Israel. And again, Moses is on the mountain meeting with God. I mean, this is like one of these huge moments in Israel's history, and you would think they would all be sitting down there singing worship songs and, who knows what. But what they're doing is it took a little while, and maybe it wasn't happening on their time scale, or they're insecure. They're worried. What's God going to say? And is this God even real? And who knows what the particular reasons were? But in the meantime, they made themselves an idol, and they start distracting themselves and having a good time. And look, so here's the thing. If you start thinking about why would someone make an idol? And then furthermore, an interesting response that you would, as it's described here, that you would sit down to eat and drink and then rise up to play. What an interesting response. While Moses is up there meeting with God, just interesting. That first of all, I think it's really important to think about why they would do this. That they were probably scared that they're in the wilderness and their future's very, very murky. Like what's going to happen? We've heard God say He's going to take care of us, but here we are. Would we have been better off into Egypt? You'll see if you read the Old Testament, you would see Israel do that a lot. Probably insecure about their future. They're probably maybe even dealing with guilt. They just made an idol. And probably dealing with guilt, feeling they don't like how they feel after they've made an idol. They're not supposed to. And so how do they cope with that? Well, they go eat and drink a lot, and they go have a good time. They enjoy some entertainment. So just to be super clear about this, the Bible is not anti-fun, all right? Depending on your church background, that may have been the impression that you've gathered over the years, is that if it's fun, if you're having a good time with it, it's probably bad, And the reality is the Bible is all about fun and celebration and good enjoyment, all that. The Bible's very pro that. However, that we could take that, and this is maybe, I don't know if I've got a least favorite of these 4 points, but this one's way up there because I love to play. Maybe it's my Enneagram 7. Maybe it's just my wire. Whatever it is that you want to chalk it up to. I really like to have a good time. I love to play. I love to sit down and watch, kind of some serial football watching, whatever. I mean, I could just watch and watch and watch. I love all that. But here's the thing. So there's nothing wrong. I'm not going to be a curmudgeon today saying, get off your phone, quit watching Netflix, whatever. I'm not going to do any of that. But what I will say, though, is we've got to be careful is that we have to acknowledge, though, that while there's a right boundary of play, entertainment, enjoying good food and drink, there's a right boundary, and the Bible lifts up all those things as enjoyments. But we can cross over into things where we're just trying to distract ourselves, where it's almost like how you would use like drinking too much or use a drug. It's actually really similar. Is you don't like how you feel, you're bored, you're lonely, maybe feel guilty about something, you're worried about something, you're insecure about something. So you don't want to deal with those things and even just take that uncomfortability to God. And so what we do instead is just kind of take that dopamine hit of, another show, another, scroll through the phone more. And it's a lot of it is in the quantity of it that we're dealing with all these feelings, these uncomfortable emotions. And instead of going to the Lord with those things, instead of acknowledging your guilt, instead of just dealing with like, gosh, I'm really uncertain about the future and taking those to the Lord, they distract themselves. So that's warning number one, not just for 20-year-olds, although if you are 20, I think this definitely applies to you. But I think if you're 60, it probably applies to you. Number two, are you experimenting with sexual sin? This is the second question. That comes from verse 8, where it says that we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. So that they committed sexual sin there as well. And this comes from Numbers 25 is the reference in the Old Testament that he just, again, rapid fire pulling from. And so there's a severe judgment that comes along with this. I do need to make a mention because it does seem like, okay, so is like God going to kill us if like we have, commit sexual sin? Or there's even another one mentioned about impatience in the next point that I think it's really important to identify here that sin is really serious. And whenever you see things like this in the Bible, that what it should make you think is like, man, like this is actually what we deserve. Whenever we sin, death is the result of sin, and that's what should happen. And good news, I don't want to spoil the whole sermon here, but really good news on why it is that God probably isn't going to kill you because you sin. Otherwise, this would be the lightest attended Sunday ever, including the preacher. That what he does instead is that he sends, the Father sends Jesus on the cross, resurrected from the dead, and that was the death that was paid for sin. That's why it is that God is not going to need to oftentimes judge us in this way, even as serious as sin is. So, but they committed sexual sin, and that's what happens there in the wilderness. And he's just pointing out, making a link between them and the Corinthians. I think it's important to point out here that we've talked about sexual sin a lot. Not because it's like our favorite topic or something like that. It's just come up a lot. Starting in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, it came up in ways in chapter 6. It came up both in talking about singleness. It came up in marriage. And it's come up a bunch over the last several weeks. And so I don't feel necessarily a huge need to elaborate other than to say, just being careful here, that I think that there's just a warning that this is going to be an area that lots and lots and lots of us are going to struggle with, probably will continue to struggle with, and it's a form of idolatry. It's one of the bigger temptations that we're going to deal with, and a bit of a warning here just to take that to the Lord. Number 3, are you impatient? Are you impatient? And that's going to come. That's going to come from verse 9. Verse 9 says, "We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and they were destroyed by the destroyer." This comes from Numbers 21, and one of their biggest things when it says they put Christ to the test, what they were doing is they were being really impatient there, and they go, "Hey, man, this isn't happening on my time scale. Here again we've been brought all the way this way. What's the deal?" And so impatience is a major temptation. And if you ever want to talk about one of these kind of sins that were like, yeah, I mean, totally. But almost like it's not that big of a deal. It would be impatience, because I think pretty much every single one of us right now would probably describe ourselves as impatient, is we are used to information really quick and getting what we want when we want it very fast. And so I think just in general, this is not something that most of us, we don't have to wait in lines a lot. I mean, we're used to things pretty immediate. And so, but here's the thing, is that I think a lot of us, we do put Christ to the test in the same way with our impatience. And our time horizon is so short most of the time that with the things that we're concerned about them right now, like in this immediate moment, the next few months, next few years. And there are loads of us in this room that have really soured on God because things have not gone according to plan and they haven't been fixed. And you've been praying for 2 whole months. And your kid has still not returned to the Lord. You've been praying for 3 whole years and your marriage is still struggling. You've been praying, that kind of thing. And we'll say those kind of things to ourselves. When's my marriage going to get better? When will my kids be okay? When will we get out of this phase that I don't really love right now with raising kids? When will I get money figured out? I feel like we're paycheck to paycheck. When am I going to get married? And our time horizon is so short, and we can get really impatient about. And if you read the Bible, you're like, man, there were generations of people that were praying in Egypt for deliverance. And all those prayers were being heard by God. Generations come and go, and then God's going to act on his own time frame. But we can get so impatient when it's not happening according to the time that we want things to happen. That's a form of idolatry, is an impatience with God in a very short time horizon. Number 4, are you regularly unhappy? Are you regularly unhappy? And this comes back to verse 10. It says, nor grumble. Grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. So yeah, there were these are all examples that were listed here, and this one is just a grumbling. You don't even have a single chapter that this would be being pulled from the Old Testament, because Israel complained so much about nearly everything. I mean, in the wilderness, just using that time alone, they complained about the food, complained about the drink, complained about the heat, complained about long walking, complained about an uncertain future, complained about Moses, complained about God. I mean, we could go on and on. It's really what they didn't complain about. And there could be like a negative bent that we can have. And so here's the thing, is one thing I've learned, and this is true for all of us, is that the more negative you get, the more negative and critical you get, kind of thing. It tends to be just this thing that kind of pulls you into it. It's really easy to do. I would even add that negative and critical people tend to go find other negative and critical people. Like you'll kind of gravitate towards people that like to complain about leaders, about God, about other people, about anything. And think about it like this. So you're at your office, the proverbial cooler, your water cooler and cubicles and all those kind of things. And you're frustrated about, let's say, a coworker, a lack of clear communication. They haven't got a project back to you, or maybe you're frustrated at your bosses, and your bosses have made a decision that you don't agree with. And you're probably not going to go walk up to the person who just grinds, who's up there and they work and they just get their stuff done, and whatever comes down from on high from management, they just do it and they do a good job and they're just a team player. You're probably not going to come pull up to that person and be like, can you believe what they did with the parking spots or whatever? Doesn't matter what it is. You're probably not going to go do that. You're probably, what you're going to do is you're probably going to go up to that person that has said to you before, man, I don't know. I mean, what do you think about this new initiative that we're on? I mean, do we feel like this is the best thing to do? Do you feel okay about that we're not going to do these kinds of projects anymore, but we're going to do, I don't know. You're going to go to that person for sure. So this is just even a warning here. Another form of idolatry, another kind of temptation that may not always be on our radar is just being regularly unhappy, a negative, critical bent. It doesn't matter if it's about the dress code policy, customers, the pay, the hours, play calls from coaches. I mean, anything at all. There's just always, well, I don't know about that. And so that's just another warning. So here's what I want you to see. is idolatry isn't just fashioning out a little bronze statue and bowing down to it. Idolatry are the things that we can replace God with, wanting things on our time frame and complaining about things, complaining about people. It could be, sexual sin. Instead of trusting God, instead of having a sexual relationship with a spouse in marriage and in that frame, that we look for it in other ways and in ways that God has said not to, and on and on. I mean, we could do this. These aren't the only 4 things, but these are 4 things that are listed here that Paul's making a special point, saying, hey, look, you're not that different than Israel. So understand that we regularly substitute things for God, and that's what idolatry is, and we're going to be tempted with that. And it's not just Israel, and it's not just Corinthians, but it's us. And that's even where we move now in verse 12 to make that link really clear that this isn't something that's only in our rearview mirror about like studying this academically, going, okay, this is an interesting study of Israel, and that's too bad that the Corinthians struggle with this, that this is about to get more personal for me and you. Verse 12. Therefore, because of all of these things, because of the link between Israel and the church, because of all of the struggles that Israel had that were shared with the Corinthians, those 4 things for people in their 20s and people in their 50s. Therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Here's a warning for us all. So it's saying, look, in case you think that you're fine and that you don't really struggle, just be careful here. Here's a tendency I've noticed from Christians, and I'm saying me and you and all of us. It's almost like, when a modern movie comes out and like a movie made right now set in like, say, the American South in the early 1960s, and when segregation was still a thing, or maybe antebellum, America, whatever. And you see a movie that's made right now with modern sensibilities, and you go back and you see segregated, restaurants and and you see those kind of things, as you immediately like judge the people back then, because they were wrong on that, by the way. But you import yourself onto those situations, and like you're way up here, they're way down there, and you would have never done what they all did. And you could do this with 1,000 different things, where you just kind of look at them almost as an outsider and kind of judge them for a really terrible thing that they did. And I feel like we do this a lot. Like when we read the Old Testament and we kind of shake our head at Israel and be like, man, they can't ever get their act together. These people grumbling and all the things they do. And I don't know what their deal was and why they couldn't get their stuff together. And even sometimes we'll read the New Testament and we'll read the Pharisees. And we'll read the Pharisees and just like eye roll. These people, can't they see what the point that Jesus is trying to make here, and those kind of things. And they see those things play out. And but here's the thing: is that this passage is saying you should see a lot more continuity between yourself and Israel. You should see a lot of continuity between yourself and the Corinthian church. Sometimes you should see a lot of continuity between yourself and the Pharisees, that you're a lot more similar to them. And we like to imagine that we are different, almost like that movie coming back in time and going, oh, I can't believe they're like this. But seeing that like, man, I'm like this. And so here's the thing, like I'm never surprised that Christian leaders fall all the time. And I'm always sad when I hear about a pastor or a big famous Christian figure that's had some kind of terrible fall, some kind of sexual sin, they got fired because of some kind of impropriety or leadership abuse or whatever the case would be. Like I'm always sad, but I would just say I'm like very rarely surprised. And this is what this passage is saying is like, hey, just a bit of a warning here. If any of you thinks that you just could never fall and you could never fall into certain kinds of sin, I'm sure there are some that would be very unlikely for you, but to say that you could never fall in some kind of area is probably the first step of falling, to think that you couldn't. That something that I've come to grips with a long time ago is there might be some areas that I'm not as prone to, but there are certain things for me that I know that I'm very vulnerable on, and that there are very few things that under a different set of circumstances I might not be capable of. And I think the first step for us is a sense of humility to know that that's us and that we are vulnerable and we need to take heed lest we fall. That's going to get built on in verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. In other words, what you struggle with it's not unique. The temptation is going to be that you're a total freak and you're out there and you're the only one that struggles with this and you're the only one that has these issues and that no one else does, and you just can't get your act together. And if people knew, you need to keep this stuff close to the vest, because if people knew what you struggle with, they would majorly judge you. I don't even want to think about what God thinks about this, because I know he sees it, so I'm just going to mess around on my phone and not deal with it, and whatever it is, But it says, look, there's nothing that you struggle with that's not common to everyone you know. And they might not struggle with this, but they struggle with that's like its first cousin kind of thing. So it says, God is faithful. He will not let you, this is where it turns real hopeful, because up till now, he's been like, hey, you're just like Israel. You're just like them. You struggle with the same things, which is not an encouraging message, if you think about it. But this is where it gets really encouraging. God will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. So you're not unique whenever you struggle with things. And I would just say that one of the things that tends to carry the most shame is sexual sin, because it's really hard to go to Sugar Brown's and lean across the table with like half the room being Redeemer people and be like, hey man, I struggle with porn, or whatever. Like it would just echo across the room. And so because of that, we're afraid of talking about the things we struggle with, right? Especially that, like it comes with such a stigma of shame. But a lot of things might. If people knew what our marriages were like, knew what some of our struggles were like, knew the kind of thoughts we have about ourselves in our head, on and on. It's like, look, that lots of people struggle with this, but God provides a way of escape, and He's not gonna tempt you beyond your ability. And some things, just as a couple of quick disclaimers before we move in just the last couple of thoughts here, is something that I'll hear people say sometimes is that God is not going to give you more than you can handle, and thinking that they're quoting this verse. But I don't think that's true. It does say He's not going to tempt you beyond your ability, but that's your ability as you trust in Christ, as you abide in Christ, that I think that He's for sure going to tempt you, and there's going to be, not He's going to tempt you, but He's going to allow temptations that are going to come to you that are beyond your capacity. That are going to be more than you can handle in many ways. I think that that's going to be the whole point, is there's going to have to be a sense of trust in God to be able to get through some of these really tough moments. Another first cousin of that one that kills me is when people will say, even apply this passage to suffering, even beyond temptation. And so, like, I've heard people with like special needs kids or something like that someone will come up trying to encourage them and say, well, God sometimes gives the biggest challenges to His most faithful people. And you're like, hold up. So you're saying that this is like this incredible challenges that my child is going to face their whole life, that this has been some kind of a reward for me because of the depth of my spiritual life. And this passage isn't saying any of that, even though God will sustain, and there's some beautiful gifts. Any parent that has raised a kid of a special needs child will know that there's a special way that God's grace intervenes in the middle of all that. But this is just making a point here that temptations are really tough, and this isn't even talking about suffering, but it's saying that Jesus is going to give you a way of escape. That's the hopeful thing, is that temptations are tough. You're just like Israel. You're just like the Corinthians, but He's going to provide a way of escape when you're dealing with it, and you're not alone in it. So I want to talk about this escape just for a moment. I think that God does this on the macro, and He does this through the cross. So because of Jesus' death and resurrection, a really hopeful thing is one of the ways that God gives us an escape is that He died for you, and He laid His life down for you. He was crucified. He was raised from the dead, and that means that when you struggle and when you are tempted, and even sometimes when you fall, that grace covers that. And there's this new identity that you have. You're now a son and a daughter. There's someday He's going to restore all things and make all things right in the new heavens and new earth. But He also does this on the micro, and this means that when you're dealing with a specific thing in the moment, that God also provides a way of escape of that specific sin. And I'm concerned that some of us are very fatalistic about some of our struggles. And even as you've heard all this today, like there's probably an area for you. It might have been one of those 4 that I mentioned earlier. And you're like, yeah, I've made lots of promises with that. I ain't even dealing with that. Like I'm going to play on my phone, and I'm going to rise up to play, and I just can't even kind of thing. But actually, He provides a way of escape. You don't have to in that moment. And so let me just give you a quick example as we wrap this up. So imagine something like being negative or critical. That was one of those 4 things we mentioned earlier. And if you have spent some time thinking about this, you'll probably realize one of the reasons that you like to be the person that questions the play calls and that complains about the boss and that complains about your friends and makes fun of other people and doesn't like your daughter-in-law's parenting or whatever. I mean, on and on. I mean, you can just do this all day long. What you'll discern is that you like to be the right one. Is that if you don't pick up the 3rd down, told you we should have run it, throw too much, whatever it is, And well, of course they're struggling in their marriage. Have you seen the way my daughter-in-law talks to those children? Like you're always from this position up here, that you're always standing in judgment. It almost protects you from disappointment. If you don't win the game, well, I told you we weren't making the right play calls. And if that marriage begins to disintegrate, well, I told you, did you see how she is? And you're always up here. Well, I told you this wasn't going to work. I told you this is a bad idea our boss had. And so there's a sense of control over your future, that you can control your own expectations. There's also a sense of superiority, that you're up here and those people over here are down here. But what would happen in the micro if God's grace were to address you and say, hey, look, you don't have to be in control. He's in control. You don't have to worry about managing your expectations because you can trust him because he's good. And I don't have to be up here. My pride can actually take a back seat. I don't always have to know what the right play call would have been. I don't always have to be speaking judgment onto my daughter-in-law. I don't have to second guess my bosses. They're in that position. I can give them feedback, but I can trust God with my future. So that's where, even in some of these moments where the macro is given through the cross, but then that cross begins to bleed into the specific here and now on how I deal with temptation, how I struggle with idolatry. He provides a way of escape and power over temptation. And this is where we conclude in verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, and let's just lay that out there, know that you are loved in the middle of your temptation. You are not alone. God sees you. The cross is proof of it. You are loved through Christ. My beloved, flee from idolatry. Let's leave temptation. We're going to struggle with it. You're going to struggle with it your whole life, but you are loved. Let's flee from the things that we struggle with. It could be those 4 things. It could be other things. And let's flee to Christ. Let me pray. Lord, would you give us that grace to flee from destructive things and flee to you, Jesus. Thank you for the cross. Thank you for your love that you demonstrate to us in a million ways. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.